Hello and welcome to the Hidden Gaps in Supplier DE&I webinar. We're going to give people another minute just to drip in, as sometimes people don't realise they need to register for StreamYard to come in. So we'll give them a couple of minutes, but welcome. We are Weave Analytics. We'd love to know what's on your mind, if anything in particular, please, for Supplier DE&I. And then we can make sure we cover it in the session today, or make sure we come back to it at the end when we do the Q&A. So please do use the comment section, the chat, or send us a private message if you prefer. We'd love to hear your thoughts, if there's anything in particular that's on your mind when it comes to supplier diversity, equity and inclusion. I'll just give people a few more seconds to drip in and then we'll get started. So welcome everybody to the Hidden Gaps in Supplier DE&I and how to fix them. I'm Angharad and this is Jane and we're from Weave Analytics. We'll do a little intro and a little bit about who we are, but today we are talking all about diversity, equity and inclusion within suppliers and supply chains. Supply chains are an extension of your business. Those suppliers are by proxy part of your business. And supply diversity, equity and inclusion is no longer a nice to have. It's no longer optional. It affects ESG reporting, it affects supply chain resilience, and also crucially, it affects brand trust and reputation. So today we're going to talk about what Supplier DE&I is, the common things that we see going wrong in businesses when they're trying to reduce the risk in this area, and what does work in this area. And of course, there'll be a plug for us at the end on what we do, but there'll be also a little bit of a bonus and of course a Q&A at the end where we'll open up to any questions you might have. But please do use the chat and the Q&A throughout. We'll answer things as we can as we go through and make sure that we're tailoring this as much to you as possible. So today we're going to cover what is Supplier DE&I, why Supplier DE&I matters, particularly right now, what doesn't work, what does work, and how to act on that. So what is supply diversity? So supply diversity actually started in the USA, and the sort of original concept and what we're calling here traditional supplier diversity was to understand and track ownership, management, and control within suppliers. So what that means is essentially ownership. So what is the makeup of shareholders? How many shareholders are women, for example? Or how many shareholders are from an ethnic minority? Management means directors, essentially. What proportion of directors are from a diverse background? And then controller suppliers is really interesting. This is essentially where they get their investment from. So you could have completely female owned, you could have complete 100% female management, for instance. But if all the investors are men, then that means that women are not totally in control 100% of that company, if that makes sense. Now, the approach to this isn't just about women or ethnic minorities. This can cover all sorts of different characteristics. It could be veterans, it could be disability, ethnic minority, gender, anybody from a diverse background. That's what people are talking about when they're talking about traditional supplier diversity, ownership, management, control. And you'll hear quite a lot of companies, particularly American companies or global companies, saying they're setting targets for percentage of suppliers that are minority owned, and they're reporting that in their annual reports and to shareholders. For example, we have a target that 10% of our suppliers are female owned, something like that. And the way companies are approaching that mainly is by tapping into advocacy groups for minority suppliers. So, for instance, we are registered with WeConnect. WeConnect is the advocacy group for female-owned businesses. Out Britain is for LGBTQ plus owned businesses. MSD UK is the UK advocacy group for ethnic minorities. We've got veteran-owned UK as well. What we've been finding, particularly with the change in dynamics in the US and the UK and Europe, and I'd say the US is actually the outlier from all sort of developing countries in this area, they've now sort of tweaked their approach a bit to this area. They now talk quite a lot about inclusive procurement or inclusive purchasing, and that focuses a lot more on SMEs, that's small, medium enterprises, small businesses. That is a slight tweak on the approach from before because of the environment that they're in, but also recognizing that small businesses are also more likely to be diverse owned, but also contribute hugely to the economy and have a lot to bring in terms of innovation, adaptability, etc. And this is all really important work because we know that if you're from a diverse background and you own a business or run a business, you're already on the back foot. And companies focusing on this means more opportunities for diverse suppliers, diverse thinking, which we know leads to greater innovation, resilience, etc. So this is a fantastic initiative, a fantastic move, and something we absolutely applaud, and is really important as we're thinking about how do we make our businesses resilient and how do we also focus on our brand reputation and also contribute even more to social value and to the economies. So this has been gathering pace in UK, Europe, and other developing countries, Australia, South Africa. And now we like to talk about supplier diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we see this as the evolution of supplier diversity. So there's a lot of good work going on in supplier diversity, but what it doesn't necessarily do is tell you who is in your supply chain, how they work, whether they create fair and equitable conditions for the people behind your products and services, and whether they share your company's diversity, equity, and inclusion values. You know, we talk a lot, and I say we, it's often Jane, and you'll find out more about Jane in a minute, talks a lot about inclusion, because diversity is brilliant. It's a great start. But you could have a completely female-owned business, could even be completely managed by women. It could be completely funded by women, but that doesn't necessarily mean there are great inclusion practices in that business, that there is fairness, that there is opportunities for all. And I wanted to just share an example of this. So our operations partners, Verizio, were actually auditing a factory for human rights. And when they were there, it suddenly dawned on them that there aren't any women here. We haven't seen one all day. And this was a factory that had been working with some big names in the UK for a long time. And it had been audited many times in person for human rights. And so they were like, why has nobody mentioned this? So they did a bit more digging around, and there were no women on site anywhere. So it's reported back to the principal client. Yes, we were here for all the human rights stuff, and here's what we found. But by the way, we also noticed we weren't there to measure or notice gender diversity, but it wasn't there. And that was really quite shocking for the principal client. And they were like, well, how has nobody even mentioned this before? And it's because as part of normal assessments, that just wasn't there. It wasn't something people were asked to look for. And when it was noticed, it was something that was related much more to culture and brushed aside. Whereas actually the principal client that was working with this factory was like, well, that is absolutely not the way we work. That is not acceptable in our world, and it could potentially affect our brand reputation, and that's just not right. So how has this even happened? How are they creating opportunities for women here? So they worked with the factory to understand their recruitment practices, how they work with their people to move the dial forwards and bring more opportunities for women into that factory environment, and therefore actually improve that supplier's business, which then helps everybody in the supply chain. So that's an example of, yes, diversity, but it was underneath was an issue with inclusive practices around inclusive recruitment, inclusive promotions, not just hiring your mates. There's inclusion is at the heart and underpins diversity. If you don't have inclusion, you can have as much diversity as you like, but it's not necessarily going to be fair and equitable for people. So that's why we as an organisation, Weave Analytics, talk about supplier diversity, equity and inclusion. So I'm going to pass on to Jane to tell you a little bit about why this matters so much now. Jane.
Thank you. So it's not just the right thing to do. We often talk about the moral case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there are also financial and regulatory imperatives. So various studies have found that when a diverse team operates in an inclusive environment, it's more effective on a number of measures than either just a diverse team or just an inclusive environment. So the combination of diverse thinking and experiences in an environment where everyone is valued and listened to drives significantly improved performance. So we've got some data here drawn from all sorts of research. Diverse and inclusive suppliers are 83% have an 83% greater ability to innovate, 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes, and they make better business decisions up to 87% of the time. And that is that diversity of thinking which is allowed to flourish in an inclusive environment. And that makes, obviously, stronger businesses. And the other issue is that the requirements are increasing. With the standards which were previously adopted by forward-thinking companies being translated into legislation and the standards themselves tightening. So I'll just run through some of those. Very relevant to us here in the UK. The UK Procurement Act, which came into force in February this year, requires public sector organisations to, among other things, open up their procurement processes to more diverse types of businesses and to include social value when assessing tenders, as well as allowing suppliers who pose unacceptable risk to be excluded. For example, Transport for London, which is a public sector organisation, excluded Accenture's marketing division from bidding for a £50 million creative contract in April this year because Accenture had scaled back on the D&I policies, and so we're no longer in alignment with TfL's own D&I commitments, so their values didn't line up. So some of the other standards, ISO 30415, specifically Clause 10, requires organisations to integrate D&I principles into each stage of the procurement process, including requiring suppliers to demonstrate a commitment to fair and respectful treatment of people. Global Reporting Initiative 414, Supplier Social Assessment, describes the reporting of social impact in the supply chain, including discrimination. Version 7 of the B Corp standards will be effective from September next year, with stricter criteria on fair pay, equity, supplier DE&I, and action plans. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive applies to the whole supply chain and how business activities affect the planet and its people. Companies subject to the CSDR have to report according to the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, assessing the risks and opportunities that arise or may arise from decision and actions taken, and external factors, including discriminatory actions. And of course, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 5, gender equity, 8, decent work, and 10, reduced inequalities, are cited as baseline expectations by many stakeholders. In short, the direction of travel is more scrutiny, more transparency, and more accountability, because inaction can no longer be seen as a neutral choice.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, absolutely the right thing to do, but absolutely also benefits businesses, and all these regulations, standards, expectations are increasing. I'm also really interested to see what the employer rights bills come up with. It's currently in consultation in the UK now, for anyone not in the UK. That will come into force over the next few years, and that has a greater focus on employee fairness, and that will also, of course, impact a lot of these things. So it's getting more and more important, especially in Europe, and that is why we founded Weave Analytics. So Weave Analytics values diverse threads woven together to create a stronger fabric. That's why we're called Weave. We help organizations reduce risk in their supply chains, build stronger, fairer supply chains. And we do that by measuring and improving diversity, equity, and inclusion, both across, so that traditional supplier diversity, as in what's the ownership and proportion of your supplier base, but also within each supplier. And that's what makes us different. We essentially work with suppliers to gather usually inaccessible data around DE&I within their businesses, and then turn it into meaningful insights and support into action plans. Now, that doesn't mean that we become the police, but you cannot measure or make any actions on things that you don't see or understand. And that's why we talk a lot about the hidden risks of DE&I in supply chains. It's something that is not commonly measured enough, and therefore it's actually opening up massive holes for businesses. So a little bit more about who Jane and I specifically are. We are half of the team at Weave Analytics. Our partners, Verizio, manage our operations, and they are specialists specifically in human rights auditing and supply chains, but they do all sorts of ESG. Check them out. But I'm Angharad Ross. Hello, I'm the CEO. I'm ex-Johnson & Johnson and Reckitt, and I founded Weave to close the good intentions gap. And what I mean by that is, in my work in these companies, I saw a lot of really fantastic DE&I work, particularly in the organizations. And also when it comes to supplier diversity, I think there's some really good things going on, particularly social value in J&J and also more recently Reckitt. But it's often done on top of everything else. I led the women's inclusion ERG at J&J, which was a fantastic experience on top of a busy job, though. And often I just felt we could do so much more. And it's brilliant, the work that goes on inside organizations. But then what about supply chains? We do all this work on our employees, which is a huge community within our businesses. Of course it is. But our next biggest community are our suppliers. And we just don't know anything near enough about what's going on in them. Jane.
Hello, I'm Jane Finch, Director of Consultancy at Weave. I'm a diversity and inclusion strategist. I had over 30 years at Pfizer with roles in training, quality, auditing, process improvement and inclusion. And I now work with organisations to help them create data-driven D&I strategies that work for their people and their business. And I completely agree with Angharad on the importance of understanding your supply chain, even at the level where your people are interacting with your suppliers, and are they being treated fairly? And there's much more emphasis now on how your employees are treated by third parties. So it just becomes more and more important.
Thank you, Jane. Not a supplier, but I remember once going to a customer and they said, "Oh, you're very young. Where's your boss?" And I was like, "I am the boss." And that was real ageism there and discrimination against my seeming age. Although, thanks to collagen, I tend to shave a few years off. But thank you, Jane. So we've talked quite a lot about what supplier diversity is. We've talked about the evolution of that into supplier diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that better meets the standards and expectations, everything from your employees to your shareholders, right the way through to the government, if you have any government contracts, B Corp, if you're a B Corp. So there is quite a lot of work going on out there, but I think there are some misunderstandings that around ownership being equated to inclusion. I've already given some examples there of how that isn't necessarily the case. Another reason that most supplier DE&I efforts fail is patchy data. There's a fair bit of data out there in terms of ownership, particularly through these advocacy groups, particularly in the US, increasingly in the UK, but outside of that, it's really patchy. And if you're looking at global supply chains, different advocacy groups in different countries, one country saying a minority group, for instance, it might be an indigenous group. That might not even occur to say the UK. It's very difficult to compare apples with apples. And even if the data does exist, which it doesn't globally, it's increasingly patchy. It can sometimes accidentally end up being a box ticking culture, particularly if you focus on diversity. Oh yes, we have 50% women on the board. Brilliant, tick, excellent. Let's all pat ourselves on the back. But that doesn't say how how safe they feel to speak up. It doesn't say whether anybody underneath them is being represented. It doesn't say that there are great inclusive practices there. And that comes back to that sort of ownership or management does not necessarily mean inclusion. A lot of companies focus only on tier 1 suppliers. Now, if you're a big organization and say you are mainly focused on your strategic suppliers in tier 1, they're highly likely to be other quite big companies, and they might also be relatively far on their DE&I journey. Brilliant. And now there's always things we can do better, right? And any time we do any kind of looking at a company, there's always room for improvement. But that's not actually looking at the bit that needs the most support. We have to look at tier 1, but we have to look at all of tier 1, including some of those smaller suppliers that might have fewer resources, ability, knowledge to do this stuff well. And we've also got to look at tier 2, because that's when you're going to start to see the things that are actually going to have a knock-on impact on your brand reputation and the resilience of your business. Reason 5 that most supplier DE&I efforts fail is standard audits miss inclusion. They might focus on diversity. They might even ask for an upload of a policy. But again, just because you've got a policy doesn't mean that policy is any good. It could have been written by ChatGPT yesterday, which we've tried. It's not very good. They need a Jane. And also, it's a high admin burden, whether it sits with HR, whether procurement are being taken away from the daily job to try and figure this stuff out. And often, people are not experts in this area. And not only is it very complex areas, Jane's already highlighted, it's constantly evolving, not just in terms of regulation, but in terms of societal expectations, employee expectations, and also trends and differences between countries. So it's the kind of thing you've really got to stay on top of. So a lot of organizations are doing great stuff, and I do not want to disrespect that at all. I think there's some brilliant stuff going on out there, and any company that's doing anything on supplier diversity is already way ahead of average. However, there are a lot of supplier and sustainability surveys going out to suppliers that have a very basic diversity, and it's usually diversity, it's not inclusion, diversity metric. And that's where it can stray into that box ticking area. And also, it doesn't tell you very much. It's great that it's there, but that's not enough to help you find those hidden risks. Often I speak to quite a lot of companies where they just rely on their supplier code of conduct. Oh, we've got a supplier code of conduct. It says we expect our suppliers not to discriminate. And my next question is always, that's brilliant. How do you check that that's true and that they're not just ticking it? And I get varied answers on that. But it's actually really hard to check up on that stuff. And that is, again, why we created Weave Analytics. Sometimes also supplier codes of conduct are not very clear. They're massive documents. They go unchecked, and we know they're not being followed up widely enough. Often companies leave DE&I to HR or employee resource groups, not procurement. And that means actually a really important part of brand reputation and risk is missed out of the conversations. And supply chain decisions get really disconnected from diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is everybody's responsibility. If you're dealing with people of any kind, that could be suppliers, internally, customers, it's important. There's often minimal supplier engagement. So once they've signed the policy as part of onboarding, or you've asked some questions through onboarding, it doesn't really often get spoken about again. Yet, as we've said, this stuff shifts all the time. I also mentioned some smaller suppliers and also maybe tier 2 suppliers might not have the resources available to improve. They don't know how to be better, or they don't know that their idea of discrimination is not your idea of discrimination. So it's really important that we all take a responsibility to help everybody have the resources, knowledge to meet our expectations when it comes to DE&I values. And we as a company hold every supplier we assess up to very high standards on this, because we believe that is the standard to meet. That is best in class, and we should all be striving to do that. There's often generic DE&I training or capability building. There are some companies that are doing some great work engaging suppliers, offering resources, and that's great, and it's a brilliant start. However, it's not necessarily tailored to the issues those suppliers actually have. Do you know whether your suppliers are ready for upcoming changes in pay gap legislation? That might actually be something they really need help with. Do you know how many are measuring social mobility? Do they even understand social mobility and the impact it has? So how can you tailor capability training or capability building without knowing where the actual gaps are? We often see companies assuming policies will just automatically reduce the risk. Well, we have a policy on that. I suppose it's a bit like the supplier code of conduct. We have a policy on that. It's clear. But paper doesn't always show a lived reality. And that's why it's about checking that policies are good policies, not just that they exist. And sometimes a policy lulls us into this false sense of security when actually there might be some things going on that we may not be so proud of. So Jane, our DE&I strategist expert, I've talked about the things that we see commonly going wrong. What do we know actually works in supplier DE&I?
Well, what actually works in supplier DE&I? So visibility across and within suppliers addresses one of your issues. Consistent and comparable data, and expert support to act on the data. So visibility across and within suppliers. So first, we've already talked about why visibility matters, because the risks and inequalities are often within the structure itself, so that ownership doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know. So it's important to identify those risks within the operation and look at the demographic data, the mechanisms there are in place for people to raise issues, and inclusive practices in the processes, and prioritizing the D&I data aligned to your business context and values. So it's, people sometimes say, oh, what's best practice here? Well, best practice will vary according to the context, and that's important. So it's important for consistent, comparable data to be able to use shared definitions, if aligned to standards, and to go beyond the ownership to include representation and fairness at multiple levels. And also looking at consistency across countries and regions. But this does mean that we clearly have to allow for the fact that in some different countries there are different legislative restrictions, and we do allow for that within the product, and then enable benchmarking and reuse across reporting and KPIs. So support to act on the data. So this is actually tailored expert guidance. So not just a rating or a grade, but clear feedback on the results that we found, and focusing on progression rather than perfection, with tools and support to build capability, and realistic milestones taking into account the business size, because what's feasible for one business might just be out of reach for another. And then really framing improvements as a partnership, as Angharad said, when this isn't about policing, this is about lifting up and building shared values and value. So the best systems don't merely flag the risk, they're going to help you do something about it.
Thank you, Jane. Absolutely. This isn't about saying, oh, don't work with these suppliers because they're in a high risk geography, or they've not scored very well. It's like, right, how do we work together to improve this for everybody? And that's why we developed our 3-step approach. So we assess suppliers across ownership, representation, and inclusion practices. Then we align that data. So we bring them together into usable dashboards. That could be like on one tab, it can be a top line shareholder summary for reporting, another one right down to the detail of exactly how each individual supplier scored across different metrics. Then we also do gap analysis. Where are the gaps versus the important elements of DE&I in your business? Where are the gaps for upcoming legislation? Where are the gaps in capability? What are the themes that we're seeing across your supplier base where you could genuinely go and make a difference? And then act. It's all well and good being given a load of data, but you actually need those turned into proper insights that can be then acted on. So action plans, roadmaps, using expert support from people like Jane, and then regularly reassessing every few years, coming back and checking, how have we moved the dial? And working in this way allows us to tangibly show you how the recommendations that we make translate into action, then can be measured again. And as they say, what measures matters. So measure what matters. And that's absolutely what we do through assessing, aligning that data, and acting on it. So what happens when you get supplier DE&I stuff right? So if you're following Jane's recommendations, you get that lower risk. There's lower risk that Panorama's going to get to that factory and notice those things before you do, which is, I think, everybody's nightmare. Genuine greater resilience. We've demonstrated from the stats at the beginning how diverse businesses and inclusive businesses, not just diverse, they have to be both, can reap great rewards for themselves, which ultimately you benefit from too, as the principal client. It helps meet the demands of standards with confidence. These standards are now expecting you to know about your supply chain and what's going on within them. You can sit there and go, oh yeah, I know it all. I got the data. I know what I'm doing next. It leads to stronger supplier engagement and alignment, and we can do that globally, and we can actually do that really quickly globally. And I think there's a really important part here on this particular point around this partnership piece that Jane and I have already mentioned, because that's exactly what this should be. We're in it together. Procurement should be seen as a strategic DE&I driver. Procurement plays a huge role in this because ultimately procurement's making decisions about where investment actually goes, and therefore the impact that investment is having more broadly on people, our planet, and our communities. And if you do this right and you've got a system that works for you, there's less admin. We take all of that away. It is a big piece of work, and that's why we exist, to take that away and make it easier and package it back in a way that is like, here's the data, here's the insight, here's the action. So what kind of things can we help with? So I've mentioned that essentially Weave Analytics, our kind of full product, if you like, is a full-scale DE&I assessment for any tier at any scale. If you know your suppliers and they're mapped out, then we can do it. If you don't know your suppliers, we can also do supply chain mapping. We can zoom in specifically on diversity if that's what companies are looking for, that ownership, management, control data. But that's not where we believe the true richness is. We've banged on about inclusion enough today, so you'll have got the message, I'm sure. But we can also zoom in on specific topics of interest. So some particular hot topics we're hearing from companies a lot about at the moment is gender pay gap. What does that look like across your supply chains? We're getting inquiries about social mobility. Who is measuring that? How are they measuring that? What does best practice look like? And what impact is it having on businesses? So we can zoom in or zoom out at any country level, at any tier level. And then we are very passionate about making sure that this stuff is actionable. So we also offer DE&I consultancy. So based on your data, here's what we're seeing. Here's what we recommend you should do next that will actually move the dial. So when you reassess, you can see a difference. So we are a small business. We are majority female owned. We're majority female managed. We are a small business. We're an SME. So we tick loads of the diverse supplier boxes ourselves. I'm going to milk that. Why not? But it also means that because of that, we are innovative, agile, we can tailor things, and we can move at pace, which is a real strength of ours. So if you're interested in chatting about this more, absolutely no obligation, but you can scan this QR code or visit our website, weave-analytics.com, to book a call or a demo. Really happy to show you a little bit more about the outputs of our work. really love to know what's on your mind as well when it comes to supplier diversity and inclusion. What have been your experiences and how might we be able to help? And as a webinar only offer for listening to this point, thank you. Mention this session. If you are interested in working with us, you get an exclusive discount. So scan the QR code, absolutely zero obligation. We would love to have a chat with you. So we've talked a lot about diversity. We've talked about inclusion and how that matters alongside diversity, and that you need both, and you need to understand both. We've talked about data visibility. We've talked about legislation. We've talked about innovation, resilience, protecting our brands. But now we'd love to hear if there are any questions we haven't answered today. And I've got a few thought starters here to get us going. See if this inspires any questions. What's your biggest supplier DE&I visibility challenge? Which part of your supply chain do you think needs more support? And what internal blockers prevent action in this area? But we'd love to hear from you. Is there anything that's on your mind still that we haven't yet covered? Any questions remaining? What's your experiences? We often find this is a tumbleweed moment. No pressure at all, but we would love to hear from you. Any questions? Doesn't look like any questions right now, but you know where we are. We're on LinkedIn. You can visit our website. You can book a call, reach out to us individually. We'd love to hear from you. Hopefully today we've given you a bit of a flavour of what supplier DE&I is, everything from the traditional supplier diversity and what metrics are looked at and how companies are currently using that, right the way through to there's some great stuff out there, and there are some things that are working, but also some things that are maybe not working as well as they could do, particularly when it comes to inclusion, and what the solution is for that and how Weave Analytics can help with that. And it's absolutely why we set it up. And you can hopefully see the passion that drives behind it. Our passion both for data and also for making the world a better place, and also getting those nice P&L benefits and resilience benefits as well. So please keep in touch with us. Share this with anybody you think might find it useful. And we hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Keep in touch and take care. Thank you. Goodbye.